This is member supported. WPFW, Washington.
Welcome to On the Margin with Ethelbert Miller. My guest today is Brian Kwoba. Kwoba is an associate professor of history at the University of Memphis. He's the author of Hubert Harrison, Forbidden Genius of Black Radicalism, published by the University of North Carolina Press. How you doing this morning, Brian?
Doing so well, Mr. Miller. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, just call me Ethelbert.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Brian, I was pleasantly surprised to see a biography of you with Harrison so soon after my friend Jeffrey Perry published his two-volume biography on Harrison. Perry published Hubert Harrison, The Voice of Harlem Radicalism, 1883 to 1918. Hubert Harrison, The Struggle for Equality, 1918 to 1927. You write in the preface of your new book, Brian, that you first learned about Hubert Harrison in the summer of 2009 from a review by Brian Jones in the Socialist Worker. What was
Mm.
in this review that pulled you into the world of Hubert Harrison?
Well, in that review, it was a review of Perry's first volume of the biography. And so it talked about Harrison's role, particularly as a Black socialist, and some of the contributions he made, both in theory and in practice, to the Socialist Party. Harrison basically brought a Black angle of vision to socialism and a socialist angle of vision to Black communities. He founded the Colored Socialist Club in Harlem, which was designed to recruit more African American workers and organizers to the party. He wrote a series of articles on the Negro and socialism, theorizing the relationship between race and class in U.S. history through a kind of Marxist or class analysis, framework. And I had never heard of him. So, so when I'm reading, I'm in a socialist organization at the time, the ISO, so I thought I knew something about socialist thinkers and figures, and I had never heard of Hubert Harrison. So that, reading the review caused me to get the book. Once I read the book, I was even more intrigued. And it's funny because as a scholar, Perry's work is so important and meticulous and detailed. But as we were mentioning before the show, his two-volume biography is nearly 1,200 pages, not including footnotes, which I think is a bit daunting for the general reader, just in terms of the sheer
Right.
right? And the attention to detail can be a little too much at times, right? And so I think that's where my book comes in because it's a one volume, it's a thematic, chapter by chapter take. It's very punchy, it's very to the point, and really offers, unlike Perry, a more Black and African centered angle of vision on some of the material that is there, the rich, legacy and dynamics of Harrison's life. And also, I get into areas of Harrison's thinking that Perry didn't really address, like, for example, Harrison's free love politics. And so, for a variety of reasons, I think my book builds on Perry's work, but also contributes a whole lot of new perspectives and ideas.
Okay, well, let's talk about Brian Kwoba. Okay, you write that understanding Harrison's life provided you with a better understanding of yourself. What did you mean by that?
Well, as the scholarly joke goes, research is me search, right? So one of the
Who
things I
told
started
you that? Who told you that joke?
yeah, it's one of those ones you hear in grad school, and it's funny because it's true in most cases, right? Like most scholars are studying something that is personal to them on one level or another. And so for me, again, I discovered Harrison um, while I was still in a socialist organization. So it was like discovering a long lost Black socialist.
What
And
led you to a socialist organization?
so it's funny. I never liked history when I was growing up. I was never particularly politically conscious until I got to college. And that's when I took a trip to Cuba to do a research project studying music. And that ended up raising a whole bunch of political and historical questions that I was not equipped to
You
answer.
sound like a young Leroy Jones.
Yeah, I mean, there's these experiences we have as young people that that cause you to expand your mind and you know, reach for new ideas and new ways of knowing the world. So when I got back from Cuba, I very quickly started to wake up and become, you know, politically conscious. And so the socialist group that I joined was just starting when I came back for my senior year of college at Cornell University. And so I joined, you know, I was idealistic. I wanted to change the world. And they were doing stuff. So I said, okay, sign me up. Let's see. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was joining a group that descends from the very same Socialist Party of America that Hubert Harrison once called his political home. And I learned, I think, a lot of kind of similar things, whether it's Marxist theory, whether it's working class politics, whether it's revolutionary history, that have served me, you know, long after I left the
Well,
socialist
let's go
organization.
back a little bit further, okay? You talk about this trip to Cuba. What about your family background? Do you come from like a working class background, you know?
Hmm.
Uh,
Yep.
so
Yeah.
talk about your parents, talk about your family.
Sure. So yeah, so I was born in Manchester, Connecticut, to a white American mother and a black Kenyan father. And my parents split when I was very young, and I grew up with my mother, who was a teacher by profession. And so, you know, I kind of got the teacher bug from a very young age. It's funny, I never thought I would become an educator myself, given that that's what my mom does. But sure enough, as fate would have it, here I am, you know, as a professor of history. So yeah, so my mom, you know, she really instilled, I think, a strong respect and admiration for education. I'm grateful. I mean, my mom's amazing. You know, she's my rock, and I most of who I am is thanks to her.
Hmm.
She also imbued with me an appreciation for other cultures, other languages. You know, she's a language teacher by profession, or at least before she retired. And so I kind of had this, you know, more worldly and more internationalist kind of understanding from a young age, which I think also, you know, shaped what I would end up doing a bit later when I traveled to Cuba and traveled to some other countries. I'm grateful and blessed to have traveled in over 20 countries at this point, and so that has been a part of my journey and my story. You know, being of a mixed racial background. I didn't know my dad
Hmm.
very well. I mean, I used to visit him maybe once a year as a child, but I had never been to Kenya, his home country, and so it would actually take some time. It wasn't
You know,
until
this sounds like the Obama story.
yeah. There's some overlap. There's some overlap. But yeah, the point is that I've been wrestling with questions of identity and belonging and navigating multiple identities, you know, as an African American and also as a Kenyan and an African. I've thought a lot about some of the questions that people like Hubert Harrison had to contend with, who, you know, also had the migration experience and multiple national identities and speaking different languages and things of that nature.
Now, you, Brian Kwoba, you place Hubert Harrison within the tradition of Black radicalism. How do you define Black radicalism, and who are some of the key individuals associated with that movement?
Well, that's a great question. You know, one of the things I do very early in the book is I use Ella Baker's definition of what it means to be radical, right? Which is basically this idea that being radical means getting to the root of the problem, right? Radish is a root vegetable. And radish and radical have the same, you know, etymology in that sense. So getting to the root of injustice and of the systems that cause injustice is what I think of as radical. And oftentimes when we look at the European traditions or white radical traditions, there's something missing in their analysis of the situation when it comes to people of African descent. So I joke, you know, and say everything gets better when you blacken it. So Marxism gets better, for example, when you blacken it. And the Black radical tradition I see as not just a derivative of white radicalisms, but actually something into itself, which has its own dynamics, its own history. I think about people like Cedric Robinson and Black Marxism. I think about, you know, Du Bois and CLR James and Ida B. Wells and Harriet Tubman. I mean, some of these folks were doing things that no one else could have done, right? No other group could have done or would have done. So for me, the Black radical tradition is about understanding the history and legacy and ongoing continuity with the previous generations of Black folks who saw a need for systemic change and getting to the root of the systems that are holding us back from true liberation.
I wonder too, you mentioned that you went to a number of countries. I was wondering when you talk about this Black radical tradition, how much you are interacting with intellectuals who are like, say, in England, where people have a strong class as well as race consciousness.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, as you know, I did my PhD in Oxford, England, and it was a great experience because I met, so many interesting and intelligent people from all over the world, and also was doing so within an institution that is quite old, quite elitist, quite Eurocentric, and problematic in various ways. And so, one of the things we did was we built the Rhodes Must Fall movement to decolonize education at the University of Oxford. And I'm just so grateful for some of the folks I met, particularly the Africans and Afro-Caribbeans who I met, because they were some of the most conscious and most politically sharp people that I've ever met. And the experiences we had, sort of trying to challenge the institution to decolonize its curriculum and its iconography and various other aspects of the university. We just learned so much, and it's one of the many examples of activism that I've been involved with through the course of my adult life that also really informs the book and how I write about Harrison, how I interpret what he's doing, given that Harrison was, if nothing else, an activist himself.
And when you just talked about your relationship with other people, talk about the relationship between Arturo Schoenberg and Hubert Harrison.
Sure. Yeah. So Arturo Schomburg, as I'm sure many of your listeners know, is one of the great bibliophiles and book collectors of the 20th century. I mean, he gathered so many materials and so much archival documentation about people of African descent that he ended up, transferring his collection. And Harrison was part of the committee that oversaw the transfer of Schomburg's collection from Brooklyn to Harlem, the 135th Street branch, where it became the foundation for
I
what
think that
we
was
now.
like the Conti Cullen Library at the one time, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I mean now it's the
Yeah,
Schomburg Center,
Schoenberg, right.
right? Because of that massive collection that Schomburg donated in 1925 with Harrison's help. And so Harrison and Schomburg they first met in the church lyceums, these debating clubs that some of the black churches in New York would sponsor. And then Schomburg and Harrison and Johnny Bruce found the Negro Society for Historical Research. And that was basically a sort of independent intellectual society for people who wanted to study African history and culture and literature and things of that nature. And so Harrison saw Schomburg as a mentor. He looked up to Schomburg because of Schomburg's vast knowledge about Africana peoples. And he learned a lot, and they would talk into the night. The stories Harrison tells in his diary of staying up into the wee hours of the night talking with Schomburg about,
Hmm.
African history and things of that nature. And so I think there was a mutual respect there, but Schomburg was a bit older, and I think Harrison saw him as a kind of mentor and,
Mentor,
and,
right.
and a guide for his study of Africana people.
Mm. Now, when we pick up your book, Brian Kwoba, you write that Marcus Garvey's movement would not have become a global one without Hubert Harrison. And I want you
Mm,
to talk about that and talk about Harrison's Liberty League, which he formed in 1917.
sure. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of people don't realize that Marcus Garvey and Amy Ashwood's original plan when they founded the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League in 1914, was to build a Tuskegee-style institute in Jamaica. Garvey looked up to Booker T. Washington. He had read Booker T. Washington's book Up from Slavery, and was inspired to create an industrial school in Jamaica along the same lines. When Garvey comes to the U.S., he tours the U.S. He, is trying to build support and raise money for this school. Once he gets to Harlem in 1917, he's down and out on his luck. He's out of money, and a lot of people have been discouraging him from building another Tuskegee because, by 1916, not only was Booker T. Washington, no longer alive. But the idea of the Tuskegee or industrial education model was kind of on the way out because people like Du Bois and the Niagara movement, the NAACP, were offering a more protest-oriented response to the Jim Crow conditions of the South. And so what ended up happening is Garvey joins Harrison's Liberty League. Harrison founds the Liberty League in 1917 as an organization with a race first program. Unlike the Tuskegee idea of getting money from rich white people like Andrew Carnegie and other robber barons to fund industrial education, Harrison's Liberty League had a mass movement orientation rather than building a brick and mortar school. Harrison's Liberty League had a Black internationalist perspective, right? Supporting the struggles of colonized peoples all over the world, including the Russian people who were making a revolution in Russia, the Irish people who were rising up against British colonialism in Ireland, and of course African people and Asian and Caribbean people who were on the move against European colonization. The Liberty League created a tricolor flag, the black, brown, and yellow, to symbolize the relationship between black folks and other peoples of color around the world. Garvey took these elements, right? The race first doctrine, the mass movement orientation, the black internationalism, the tricolor flag. These are key elements that he used to reimagine the UNIA and to actually scale it up and build it up into the largest international organization of African people in modern history. That would not have been possible, or almost is unimaginable without the role of Hubert Harrison in the Liberty League, which is another reason why I think it's so critical that people learn about Harrison, that he played a decisive role in catalyzing the rise of Garvey and Garveyism.
When you mentioned that, I was thinking of like, yeah, we talk about Elijah Muhammad, but we don't talk about W.D. Fard. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Where somebody
Mm,
introduces something, and
mm,
and I wonder in terms of you as a teacher, and you probably, well, your course it might be different, but I came through all these classes, and we talked about Garvey, and we never mentioned the Liberty League.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, Harrison has been marginalized and kind of erased from popular memory and even from scholarly historiography. And I mean, we can get into the reasons for that. In this case, there's a lot of reasons for that, but in this example I just mentioned, part of the reason for Harrison not being remembered in Garvey movement historiography is because Harrison, ends up becoming quite critical of Marcus Garvey. Harrison, joined the Garvey movement. He edited Garvey's Negro World newspaper as it became this global transnational force. And yet and in that capacity, Harrison's able to see Garvey up close, in the Negro World headquarters, in Liberty Hall, in these other settings. And he develops a lot of misgivings about Garvey's authoritarian behavior. He felt like Garvey couldn't handle, anybody in the organization who might outshine him or who might have more knowledge than him. He doesn't like Garvey's imperial designs on Africa. Garvey envisioned a black empire over which the sun would never set. Harrison was an anti-imperialist. He said, capitalist imperialism is the enemy we need to fight. And so there's all these clashes and kind of differences of opinion and divergences of vision between Harrison and Garvey. And so Harrison becomes quite critical of what he sees
But look
as,
what you just said. Okay, okay. So you and we're in a class. We're some little black club or whatever.
yeah.
And we got a little Marcus Garvey stuff right happening. And what happens is that maybe because of our background and stuff like that, we get to college. Oh, we want to have an organization, and we hold up Garvey
Mm,
without looking at all of the problems that it's almost as if we have a different image of Garvey today,
yeah.
primarily because we don't want to be critical of Garvey.
Mm, mm.
But Harrison was critical.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I don't think anybody should be valorized or glorified and put on a pedestal such that they become beyond criticism. And this is again, this is one of the reasons why Harrison is not better known, is because the Garvey movement did not want to remember him. Marcus Garvey himself
Yeah,
didn't
but I
want to
but I
remember.
I I think of people who were investing in the Black Star Line who like I want my money back. you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a whole number of people who were initially excited about Garvey, including Du Bois. Du Bois initially was like, "Oh, this looks like it might have some promise." But over time, as folks kind of saw which direction Garvey was taking things, this is to me is just a classic case of HNIC gone wrong,
Right.
right? Which is to say, if you have a singular individual at the center of your organization, it becomes a limitation because you're limited by what that single individual is willing to do, and also if they get taken out of the scene, as Garvey was deported, it can be crippling.
Okay, well then let's ask. Let me ask you this question. Um, what was Harrison's relationship with W.B. Du Bois? And when we look at, say, the Crisis, did the Crisis run articles that were critical of, of Garvey that maybe Harrison said, okay, let me write something that and get it published in the Crisis magazine?
No, actually, Harrison, you can search the entire archive of the Crisis and not find a single mention of Hubert Henry Harrison, because Harrison had his own clashes with Du Bois, particularly during World War One. During World War One, Du Bois unfortunately essentially capitulated to the
Right.
pro-war politics of the government. In fact, Du Bois attempted to become a captain in military intelligence, which was seen as a big sellout when Harrison exposed that fact.
Mm-hmm.
And Du Bois writes this famous editorial called "Close Ranks," right, where he says we need to close our ranks while this war lasts and get behind our fellow, white citizens to support the war effort. Again, Harrison was an anti-imperialist. He was critical of World War One, critical of the role of the U.S. and other imperial powers, and so he clashed with Du Bois, and exposed this kind of about face that Du Bois had made. I think that's one of the reasons why Du Bois and the NAACPers did not want to remember Harrison or record him as part of their historiography. Um, but yeah, I mean, Du Bois, of course, becomes very critical of Garvey, and so do others. Cyril Briggs and the African
Mm-hmm.
Blood Brotherhood are critical of Garvey. Garvey had a lot of critics, but what's different about Harrison is that Harrison is an internal critic. Harrison is inside the UNIA. Harrison is editing Garvey's newspaper. So he's not throwing rocks from the outside. He's making assessments based on his direct lived experience, firsthand experience
Well,
working with
let's well
Garvey.
let's well let's look at this, and I don't have to be critical of our scholars, but when we look at some of the books that have come that say we were teaching a course on the New Negro Movement, Harlem Renaissance, okay, Huggins people, there's certain people we say, okay, I'm going to use this book, whether it's Reverend Lewis or whoever, and
Mm,
and you still don't see Harrison there.
hmm
No,
hmm
no, I can understand somebody saying, okay, I'm living through the same time. I don't want to take a decision between Du Bois and Harrison. But here are scholars like yourself. You're
hmm
doing the work. How come people didn't do the work earlier?
Mm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. One of which is that Harrison is such a rare bird. He doesn't fit into any clean-cut category or ideology or political framework. And so if you want to kind of do him justice, you have to study a lot of different frameworks. You have to study a lot of different intellectual and political traditions in which Harrison stood. And that's a tall order. Most
Mm,
people would like to have a more cut and dry, oh, it's Washington versus Du Bois, or oh,
right.
it's Garvey versus Du Bois, or oh, it's
Ali against Frazier.
right, right,
Right.
right, right. And then a lot of the Black women's history, it's like, oh, let's do a history of the blues women. Or
Right.
let's talk about Zora Neale Hurston, or let's look at Ida B. Wells, and that's great and that's important, but once again, you can see why they wouldn't be even having someone like Harrison on their radar screen.
Mm,
Despite the fact that Harrison worked with Black women, in the Black Women Club movement, and in many other settings, in the
yeah.
Socialist
Well,
Party,
let me
in
ask
the
you two
government.
questions before we go on a break. Okay. Two
Mhm.
questions which I think are very important to sort of create a backdrop for Harrison's and others. And
Mm.
I want to ask you these two questions. One, how did the Russian Revolution, 1970, affect Black thought? And the other is the influence of Irish nationalism.
Great questions. Yeah, so the Russian Revolution was. a groundbreaking event. I mean, it really, in some ways, sparked a world revolution because Europeans across Europe, there was massive labor rebellions, working class upheavals, and the whole colonial world as well. There were a number of anti-colonial rebellions that took inspiration. So yeah, the Russian Revolution gave inspiration to Black folks here in the U.S. By, for example, encouraging the formation of the Communist Party when the Socialist Party split during World War I, and you had the kind of moderate, reformist, and pro-war socialists on the one side, and the more radical, anti-war socialists on another. The Russian Revolution, contributed to situations where people could see more clearly, oh, there's a new sense of possibility now. Workers and peasants in Russia have risen up, not only overthrown the Tsar, but have taken power through their own elected councils, what they called Soviets, of radical grassroots democracy that have overthrown capitalism and imperialism and all these other systems. We need to learn from that, right? We need to understand that. That's how many Black folks, particularly, Black radicals, were inspired. And so Ireland, as part of that larger global awakening that's happening during and after World War One, was another place where, there's a history there, right? Frederick Douglass, for example, had traveled to Ireland as an abolitionist.
Is
Um,
this where we get the like the Liberty House connection? Is it like a because it's
uh,
a there's that Irish was that was something that Garvey might even borrow, or does that come from Harrison with the Liberty League?
That's the Harrison, the Liberty League. Yeah.
Okay.
And there was the Liberty League. There was also the Liberty Congress in
Hmm.
1918, a gathering of, African Americans who wanted to voice the special grievances of
So
African
none of that
Americans.
Liberty stuff was borrowed from the Irish.
Some of it could have been.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly about the Liberty Hall or Liberty League, but Harrison and the Liberty League discussed Ireland. They discussed the meaning of the struggle for Irish liberation against British imperialism, and they could see that actually the Irish were doing things that African Americans could do, like forming their own organizations, not just relying on, English liberals to get free. Right. Harrison was like, yeah, we need to do like the Irish and do for ourselves, right? Form our own organizations. I mean, that's part of the impetus for Race First, this idea of do for self, as a Black community. He's taking inspiration from places like Ireland. And this is another thing that Garvey learns from Harrison, right? Why the struggle for Ireland is relevant to Black people, given the similarities and types of oppression that Irish and Ireland are experiencing under the Brits, and that African Americans are experiencing under, white supremacy here in the U.S.
Well, hold that thought, I'll just ask this question. When
Mhm.
you think about that, but then you go back to like the Civil War with the draft riots in New York. It seems like
Mhm.
the Irish, this relation between the Irish and Black people, has a
Mhm.
different history in the States.
Yes, yes. Well, yeah. I mean, initially, the Irish, at many times have been treated like dogs. I don't think they've ever been treated as poorly as Black folks, but there was a lot of discrimination against them. At some point, they became white, right? There's
Hmm.
a whole story about how the Irish became white, and were able to be kind of co-opted into the capitalist system and join the kind of white supremacist mentality that other European Americans, had been trained in, prior to them coming. And so, yeah, there's a conflicted history
Hmm.
there, and I
When you
think,
say that, it almost reminds me of how Baldwin was writing about how Jews became white,
Mhm.
in terms
Yep,
of the relationship here. Well,
yeah.
Brian, a lot more to talk about. My guest today is Brian Kwoba. We've been talking about his new book, Hubert Harrison, Forbidden Genius of Black Radicalism. The station is WPFW 89.3 FM. My name is Ethelbert Miller.
Peace! This is your social justice calendar for the week of September 1st, 2025. On Saturday, September 6th at 12 noon, a coalition of DC area organizations, including the Metro Council, AFL-CIO, Free DC, and many more, are calling on allies from the region and nationwide to join DC communities for We Are All DC, a national march in solidarity with DC communities to end the occupation of DC. The march will convene Saturday, 11 a.m. at Malcolm X Park on 16th Street between W Street and Euclid. It will begin at 12 noon and continue on to the White House. For more general and updated info, visit wearealldc.com. On Saturday, September 6th from 12 to 4 p.m. at University of DC, 4200 Connecticut Avenue, Northwest Washington, D.C., Rising organizers host the DC Community Organizing Festival, a gathering of over 20 grassroots organizations ready to connect, learn, and take action together. For more info and to register now, go to bit.ly/DCOrgFest. Sunday, September 7th from 7 to 9 p.m., Haile Garima and Sankofa Video and Books present Congo on Our Mind, a bi-weekly community gathering, artists and performers committed to liberation and justice. Located on 2714 Georgia Avenue, Northwest Washington, D.C. For more info, visit sankofa.com. WPFW's Social Justice Calendar connects you to grassroots activism in the DMV. Submissions can be emailed to socialjustice@wpfw.org. Please include the name, date, and address of the event. This is due by Thursday at 5 p.m., at least 1 week in advance of your event. WPFW's Social Justice Calendar helps build a better world, one broadcast at a time.
Okay, we're back on the margin with my guest, Brian Kwoba. Brian Kwoba is the author of Hubert Harrison, Forbidden Genius of Black Radicalism, a book that's published by the University of North Carolina Press. Brian, when we think about God, we think about the Back to Africa movement. How did, and you sort of talked about this in the first half of the show about, Garvey having this sort of imperialistic view of Africa because of the times. How did Harrison look at Africa? What did he feel Africa could teach African Americans?
Well, that's a great question, and one of the most distinctive areas of Harrison's thinking, right? Because, I mean, you got to remember the time. In 1906, the Bronx Zoo placed a Congolese man, Otabanga, on display in the monkey house section of the zoo. So there was a lot of Afrophobia and, prejudice about Africans in Africa. They were seen as, an uncivilized, savage people who needed to be civilized and, Christianized from outside. Harrison had a very different view to that prevailing notion. Harrison, right next door to the Bronx in Harlem, as early as 1907, he's identifying himself as a, quote, untamed, untamable African. And I just find that such a refreshing, rejection of the anti-African views of the day. Harrison said, we need to learn what Africans have to teach us because they have much to teach us, right? Everybody else was talking about, oh, we're going to teach the Africans, we're going to civilize them, we're going to Christianize them. Harrison was like, no, 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 we need to learn from them. We need to have some respect and humility for African history, which Harrison studied, right? He knew about the classical African civilizations, ancient Mali, ancient Ghana, Egypt, and so on. Like he did a deep study of African cultures. He would speak about cultures in Africa and history and politics on the continent, the colonization of Africa, because he had a level not just of identity as an untamable African, but as I said, he had what I call a radical humility towards Africa and African peoples, which allowed him to keep learning and to keep asking new questions and to keep growing rather than to think, as many other Black folks had at the time, that they were superior to Africans, that Africans in the West or in the diaspora had something to, teach the continental Africans. And so yeah, I find that one of the most kind of unusual and distinctive areas of his thinking, which of course other people in subsequent generations would adopt, right? Not. I mean, many people after Harrison would come to realize that, African liberation was not something that was going to come from outside of Africa, but was actually inherent within.
Hmm. How did Harrison deal with the issue of Islam? I think I saw a reference to Jus Muhammad in your book, but
Yep.
that's another person because when we come even to today, the last several years, we have Chancellor Williams' book, Destruction of Black Civilization, where somebody says, well, Islam is just as destructive as Christianity, in terms of the African people. How did Harrison view Islam?
Great question. Yeah, I mean, Harrison, like his fellow Virgin Islander Edward Wilmot Blyden, they both viewed Islam as favorable compared to Christianity for African people. Harrison, pointed out, for example, that in Islam there's the Ummah, the community of Muslims, which doesn't, at least officially doesn't discriminate or segregate based on race.
Hmm.
Whereas the church in Harrison's day, especially, was a Jim Crow church, right? I mean, you had white churches that were just racist and anti-black, that would not allow black people to become congregants. So Harrison did, I think, see Islam as more favorable, as a better option when it comes to
Hmm.
religion for black folks. But at the same time, Harrison was an agnostic, right? He was a free thinker. He was critical not just of Christianity and the church, but of religion more generally, because I think he saw it as something that was colonizing the minds of people and pulling them in a conservative direction in the sphere of ideas. And so Harrison, that's another distinctive thing about him. There weren't a lot of black free thinkers in the 1910s, and Harrison becomes one of the most prominent among them, right? He's writing in free thought publications. He's adding a black voice to this larger movement that's demanding separation of church and state, and trying to get a more secular and progressive kind of situation for people, given the role that the church had played in conservatizing people and holding back some of the liberatory struggles against capitalism, against imperialism. I mean, Harrison saw the church as being in league with the capitalists to
Hmm.
dupe and exploit the workers of the world, right?
Well,
So,
that leads us into which I feel is perhaps one of the most important chapters in your book, and that's chapter 6, which is entitled "Black Free Love and the Queer New Negro." You write that Herbert Henry Harrison broke new ground for the Black radical tradition in relationship to the most personal, sensitive, and controversial topics, sex.
absolutely.
Talk about that. I mean, we're dealing with birth control and Margaret Sanger, but we're also talking about, this whole presence of the 1920s, where there's a strong gay movement that's just was taking place. So talk
Mhm.
about that in terms of Harrison.
Sure. So in 1917, Harrison gave a series of lectures on sex, and this fact alone opened up the whole chapter that I wrote about this, because it's so fascinating when you look at what he was talking about. Harrison, as far as I can tell, is the first black figure in U.S. history to denounce church and state repression of sexuality, um, to give a public-facing lecture series on sex education, to advocate for decriminalizing access to contraception, and to defend a love style based on freedom and variety as against the compulsory monogamy that predominates within the culture. And again, he's doing this at a time when that was an extremely risky and radical thing to do, because there were so many government laws, criminalizing all manner of things sexual. State laws, both federal and state laws, were doing this. The church, of course, was preaching against all manner of things sexual.
It sounds like the laws that are coming being passed in Texas today.
Absolutely. Yeah. And some of them are relying on legislation from that era. I mean, the Comstock laws, for example, which were these federal laws named for Anthony Comstock, who was, persecuting people who wanted to sell erotica or distribute sex education information or just create paintings with too much skin. The Comstock laws are still in effect, and I believe there's a case in Arizona where they're trying to prevent the abortion pill, and they're leaning on the Comstock era legislation. So yeah, I mean, it's that chapter really helped me to understand how and why it is that our culture and our society is so sexually repressive, because you realize that's part of a larger system of oppression, right? And this is what is so important about Harrison, is that Harrison was able to connect capitalism and colonialism and white supremacy and Christianity to compulsory monogamy, right? Seeing
Mhm.
that actually this is part of the larger European colonization project, because cultures all over the world, in Africa and many other indigenous cultures, they never made monogamy the center of the universe when it comes to love and sex. And in fact, many cultures around the world have deliberately and intentionally non-monogamous erotic energy exchange traditions that have value or that have some type of spiritual meaning for the community. And so Harrison, again, he was a widely read person. He understood cultures in other parts of the world. He was looking at the history of sexual ideas and how we even got to this place where monogamy is seen as the one size fits all or the be all and end all. And I think that's again one of the most controversial, perhaps, but generative aspects of Harrison's thought, because as you said, in the 1920s, you have the so-called Renaissance with blues women who are, singing about same-sex relationships and non-monogamous relationships and women's, autonomy. You have all these sort of black
And
sexual
you had
revolutions.
these drag balls going on that I think
Yeah,
Harrison went to one.
yeah. Harrison goes to a drag ball in 1926, and he has a great time, and he's shocked that, some of the people on the dance floor are not actually women because they're so attractive. And Harrison was friends with people like Claude McKay and Langston Hughes and Richard Bruce Nugent, who in some ways represent kind of like the first generation of folks who were, well, they weren't all.
Let's add another name in here, because it's a very important in terms of why perhaps Harrison is not mentioned. Alain Locke. Now
Yeah.
it seems as if Locke keeps Harrison's work out of Survey Graphic and his anthologies.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean Locke was sexually fluid himself and a free lover.
Sexually fluid. I like how you say that.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, as you said, his volume, The New Negro in 1925, essentially reinterprets the meaning of the post-war New Negro as a quote unquote Renaissance of arts and culture, which is not what Harrison's generation, meant when they said New Negro movement. I mean, Harrison's generation was talking about Black socialists, Black communists, Garveyists, right? A more kind of politically awakened new Negro. And Locke is trying to do this high art, Renaissance of quote unquote high
But
art.
let me ask you this
And
question, Brian, because this is very, if, for example, um, Locke had included um, his work,
yeah.
Harrison's work,
Mhm.
in the survey graph, would we be teaching Harrison, or he would be more well known?
Absolutely, yeah, because Locke considered adding Harrison, but he deliberately edited Harrison out not once but twice
Hmm.
from the New Negro anthology because Locke is working for a white publisher, right? And Harrison is talking about capitalism and the church and Black radical sort of awakenings, which the white publisher and didn't, I think, want to see in print, and so yeah, I think had Harrison been in that volume, the New Negro anthology. I mean, here's the sad part. It's not just that Harrison is it's not just that there isn't a piece like an essay or a piece of writing from Harrison. Harrison's not even in the bibliography of that volume, despite the fact that he'd already published two books about New Negro politics by 1925. So there's a deliberate, erasure or extrusion of Harrison
Now,
from.
was some of this perhaps because he was also critical of Carver and Vector?
Yeah, I think that's a part of it. Harrison said something funny. He said the matter of a Negro literary renaissance is like the snakes of Ireland. There isn't any. So, so he saw this whole quote unquote Renaissance trope as basically a fad that white publishers were enlisting certain black gatekeepers to promote in order to sell the Negro to white audiences, right? And picking only the most non-threatening and patriotic examples of Negro art that they could find. Even the artists that were radical, like Claude McKay, is in Locke's anthology. But the piece that Locke included, he actually neutered McKay's title. The piece was called "The White House," and it was a scathing attack on the anti-black hatred that was emanating from the White House. Locke changed the title to "White Houses." Like, oh, these are just, some white houses that are problematic in the country, not the White House, right? And so there's a way.
He's talking about gentrification.
Right, right, right. So there's a way that Locke's volume neutered and neutralized, even the artists that it included who had something radical to say, never mind those who it excluded.
Well, your book, Brian Cuomo, has something with what I found reading today extremely radical based on some of the things I saw happening within our community way back in the 70s and 80s. You have in chapter 26, you talk about the African roots of the queer new Negro in Harlem. You
Mhm.
sounded, there was this like Audre Lorde going back and finding something to say, okay, well, we were always gay back, and it didn't have anything to do with,
Mm,
within African culture.
mm.
There are these sort of trends that you say, okay, we have to acknowledge it. It's not invisible, it's here. And, and
Right.
and I felt when I was reading, I said, wow, where was Brian back in 1975?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's another thing that I was happy to include because, people have this notion that quote unquote homosexuality is un-African. And it's just a completely ignorant and ahistorical notion because when you actually look at the vast range of sexualities on the continent, especially before colonization, you find a whole number of different things. I mean, just to give one example, the Dagara people of Burkina Faso, what we think of as quote unquote LGBTQ folks, they called them gatekeepers because they saw them as having the keys to the gates between the material world and the spiritual world. In other words, their sexual fluidity was seen as part of their spiritual elevation, and they could play certain roles in the community, balancing masculine and feminine energy imbalances, right? Being peacemakers, bringing stability to the community. They had a role to play that was respected. They were not persecuted. They were not driven into hiding or driven underground. They were actually respected in the community of the Dagara people. And this is just one of many, many, many examples, right, of a kind of different way of thinking about spirituality and sexuality and people who don't fit into the binary that white Westerners have tried to impose so rigidly on the rest of the world.
I asked you earlier about defining the black radicalism, okay?
Hmm.
You introduced another term that I want you to expand on, and that is black free love politics. What did you mean
Hmm.
by that?
Absolutely. So Harrison is speaking explicitly about free love from as early as 1914. Again, the first, black voice in U.S. history that I could find who was doing this. Because there's already a free love tradition among white sex radicals that goes back at least to the 19th century. So people like Victoria Woodhull, for example, the first a white woman who was, part of the white women's rights movement in the 19th century, and the first woman to run for president, and someone who has a fascinating history of her own. That generation, they basically said, look, we're free lovers because we see marriage as an institution that not only subordinates women in these particular ways, but also stifles romantic and sexual freedom. So in a country that's founded on the idea of freedom, right, you would think that idea like this would take up more traction, but the fact that it hasn't shows how central this idea of making monogamy compulsory, and that's why I say compulsory monogamy most of the time, is that it's not the problem of people choosing to decide that the maximum number of partners they're ever going to have at any given time is one. It's making that compulsory, right? Making that one particular format or idea compulsory for everybody. And that's what the free lovers, I think, were protesting. And so Harrison, he is learning from veterans of the free love movement, people like Edwin C. Walker, who I try to resurrect and restore in the book, a pioneering free lover, free thinker, and free speech advocate. Harrison is bringing a black angle of vision to the free love sort of tradition and politics, and looking at the ways in which, for example, you have a situation where lynching is not only a national epidemic, but oftentimes included castration. So there's a direct attack on black masculine erotic power, just as, black women domestics working in the white homes in the South often faced rape and sexual abuse, which was an attack on the erotic potential and power of black women. And so, yeah, Audre Lorde is someone I also mentioned in the book because she was very clear about the ways in which oppression has to distort and corrupt anything within oppressed communities that can give them energy for change and energy for resistance, including erotic energy. And she's talking about the erotic suppression of women But we could say, as I said, the same thing about black men, given the lynching and castration that is so rampant in this period. So for Harrison, in this context of church repression, state repression, anti-black repression of sexuality, for him to come out as a black free lover is extraordinary because he's basically upending the whole myth of the black male brute, right? Or
Hmm.
he's reinterpreting that, right? Part of the ideology of Jim Crow was to say black men are a sexual threat, quote unquote, to the purity of white women, and by extension to the masculinity of white men. And therefore, that's why we have to lynch them, right? Like Harrison is upending that whole thing and just saying, look, if we want political liberation or economic liberation, we're never going to get there if we don't deal with sexual liberation because it's all part of this larger system that has been imposed through capitalism and colonialism and all the rest of it.
I'm going to ask you two more questions. There's something that I didn't mention, ask you about, but I think it's key in terms of the beginning of Harrison's career. And you have some photographs that sort of capture that. We haven't talked about him as an orator. We haven't talked about him being on a street corner.
Hmm.
Talk about just the importance of that.
Oh, it was huge. I mean, Harrison, he used to speak on street corners, places like 135th Street and Lenox, right outside the library, and many other corners in New York. He used to speak to massive audiences, audiences large enough to block traffic, because not only did he have a brilliant mind and encyclopedic knowledge, but he was able to make it accessible to people, as I try to do in my book, right? Make the knowledge accessible to the people. And there's a story in 1912 of him speaking. This is 99 years before Occupy Wall Street. Harrison occupied a group of people on Wall Street for 3 hours, occupied their
Mm.
attention, speaking on socialism right in front of the New York Stock Exchange. You know, so there was a boldness, a sort of fearlessness in Harrison's praxis that a lot of people described what emerges in Harlem as an outdoor university because the street corner speakers, not just Harrison, but some of the others who
And
emerged,
that's the tradition of that we see of Malcolm X
yes,
eventually.
it's a tradition that goes all the way, yeah, far beyond Harrison's time. It was the place where people actually socialized, where people actually got to sort of collectively work through some of the world events of the day and situations, because there was no internet in 19,
Right,
there was no
right,
television in
right.
1910, right? Like culture was lived in a face-to-face, outdoor, oftentimes fashion, especially in Harlem. And so Harrison is a pioneer in that tradition of getting up on the stepladder and addressing the masses right where they are.
All right. Well, the last question is a difficult one for you. We talk about Harrison being excluded. If, for example, you're working on one of these Norton projects, what essay or you say, okay, we we want people to know that we know that he has been taught. Is there an essay or something that we can say, read this by Harrison?
I think the best place to start in terms of Harrison's own work is his book When Africa Awakes, which thankfully has been reprinted. Black Classics Press, for example, shout out to them. They reprinted the volume because it's a collection of Harrison's essays from various different publications. Some of it from his socialist work, some of it from his own Liberty League and Voice newspaper. Some of it from the New Negro magazine, which he edited in 1919, 6 years before Locke's New Negro. And he wrote that book, When Africa Awakes, for the occasion of the first international UNIA convention, the Garvey movement's first, convention, to try to push the Garvey movement in a more class-conscious, anti-imperialist, and politically engaged direction. And so it's a great piece of literature. It gives a range of Harrison's ideas and thoughts, and it's still available. As I said, I think that's one of the best places to start.
Okay. What's the photo documentation of Harrison? Do we just see, just the same pictures or there's the photos that, for example, have not been given to the public yet?
I mean, there's not a lot of photos of Harrison, unfortunately, and part of why I had a pencil artist do the
Right.
the cover of my book was to try
Okay.
to basically make another photograph,
All
right?
right.
And he
Okay.
based it on a photograph, but he actually drew. This is a pencil drawing,
Right.
and so
And it
I'm
looks
trying.
good. Okay, I gotta stop you there. It looks good. Okay, okay, he
Thank you.
looks good. And,
Yeah,
and so
yeah,
Brian
yeah. You
Kwoba,
probably didn't think.
Yeah, I just want to thank you for being my guest. My guest today has been Brian Kwoba. We're talking about his book, fantastic book, Hubert Harrison, Forbidden Genius of Black Radicalism, published by the University of North Carolina Press. The station's WFW 89.3 FM. The program is On the Margin with E. Ethelbert Miller. Thank you.